In 1987, the United States executed 25 people. Each case is more than just a sentence, it's a story of crime, trial, and punishment. In this video, we'll go through their crimes, their trials, their last meals, final words, and the way they were executed. Welcome to Criminal Records. Ramon Pedro Hernandez, State, Texas. In 1980, 29-year-old Ramon Pedro Hernandez walked into a closed gas station in El Paso, Texas, trying to rob the place. Inside was Oscar Martin Frere, a 33-year-old night watchman from Juarez, Mexico. Hernandez shot him 3 times and ran off without taking any money. Frere, who also worked as a mechanic, was found dead at the scene. The police quickly tied Hernandez to the murder through witness statements and ballistic evidence. Hernandez was arrested soon after. During his trial in El Paso, he was found guilty of capital murder. Even though the court appointed him lawyers, like Richard Lovelace, Hernandez often represented himself. He refused to file any appeals or ask for clemency. The courts noted he had a surprisingly strong understanding of the legal system. As his execution date got closer, his lawyer and family begged him to let them fight for his life. But Hernandez stood firm. He said, "My life is insignificant. If they're going to execute me, I know exactly what I'm doing." Texas Attorney General Jim Maddox agreed. Hernandez could have easily gotten a delay if he'd wanted one. His lawyers still filed a last-minute appeal without his permission, but it was denied. On January 30th, 1987, at 1:13 a.m., Hernandez was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He was 36 years old. Witnesses said he was calm, though a bit nervous when the staff had trouble finding a vein for the IV. For his last meal, he asked for beef tacos, a beef enchilada, a jalapeno pepper, hot sauce, and a cup of coffee. His final words were to his common-law wife, Velma Hernandez. He looked at her and said, "I'll always love you. You know that. That's all." Eliseo Hernandez Moreno, State, Texas. On October 11, 1983, 24-year-old Eliseo Hernandez Moreno began a 5-hour killing spree that would leave 6 people dead and shock the entire state of Texas. Armed with a stainless steel .357 Magnum revolver, he set out from College Station in search of his estranged wife, Esther Garza. What started as a domestic dispute quickly escalated into one of the most violent rampages in Texas history, spanning over 130 miles. His first victims were his wife and brother-in-law, Esther and Juan Garza. Moreno shot and killed them both at point-blank range. Soon after, he encountered Texas Highway Patrol Officer Russell Lynn Boyd north of Hempstead. Boyd had pulled him over for a traffic violation. Moreno responded by shooting the officer 6 times. Although Boyd's bulletproof vest deflected 2 shots, the others struck his torso and head. As the officer lay wounded on the roadside, Moreno executed him with a final shot to the head. Now heavily armed. Having stolen Boyd's blue steel point .357 revolver and a 12-gauge Remington shotgun, Moreno continued his rampage in the town of Hempstead. There, he murdered 3 elderly residents: 70-year-old retired nurse Ann Bennett, her 79-year-old sister Allie Wilkins, and 62-year-old James Bennett, their brother-in-law. Moreno was tried and convicted of capital murder for the killing of Officer Boyd. In 1985, he received additional prison sentences for the other 5 murders. He pleaded guilty to all charges and refused to appeal any part of his sentence. He told his lawyers in the court that he believed he deserved to die for what he had done. During his time on death row, Moreno experienced a religious conversion. He became a Bible study teacher, expressed remorse for his crimes, and wrote letters to the victims' families seeking forgiveness. According to his father, Moreno accepted full responsibility and believed his execution was just. For his last meal, he requested 4 cheese enchiladas, 2 fish fillets, French fries with ketchup, milk, and lemon pie. He was executed by lethal injection on March 4, 1987, at 12:12 a.m. at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 27 years old. Texas Attorney General Jim Maddox witnessed the execution and later said that Moreno entered the death chamber smiling, even joking. "I'm ready for the rocket to take off so I can go home." Moreno's final words were, "I would like to say that I am here because I am guilty. I hold no grudges against anyone. The word of God tells me that the wages of sin is death. I'm willing to pay according to the laws of Texas because I know I am guilty." He was pronounced dead at 12:19 a.m., just 7 minutes after the injection began. Joseph Holcombe Mulligan, State, Georgia. On April 13, 1974, 24-year-old Joseph Holcombe Mulligan traveled from South Carolina to Columbus, Georgia, with his accomplice Timothy Helms. Their goal was to kill Patrick A. Doe, Mulligan's brother-in-law, as part of a bitter family dispute involving divorce and a life insurance policy. After an argument while washing Doe's car in the parking lot of Marion Jones Miller's home, Doe's girlfriend, Mulligan fatally shot Doe with a .38 caliber revolver. To prevent her testimony, Mulligan then killed Miller as well. Mulligan acted as the mastermind behind the plan. He recruited Helms by paying him and used false identities to hide their presence in Columbus. Prosecutors argued the murders were intended to allow Mulligan's sister to collect Doe's life insurance before the divorce finalized. In 1976, Mulligan was convicted and sentenced to death for both murders. However, the Georgia Supreme Court later overturned the death sentence for Doe's murder, leaving only the sentence for Miller's murder intact. During his legal process, Mulligan showed substantial knowledge of the law and even represented himself in critical moments. Though he initially appealed his sentence, by 1985 he dismissed his lawyers and refused any further appeals. He declared, "My life is insignificant. If I'm going to be executed, I know exactly what I'm doing." Because Georgia law did not require automatic review of death sentences when the defendant waived rights, this accelerated his path to execution. On May 15, 1987, after the U.S. Supreme Court denied a last-minute stay by a 7-2 vote, Mulligan was executed by electrocution at Jackson State Prison, Georgia. His case was controversial. Groups like the NAACP argued racial bias influenced the process. Still, the state maintained Mulligan consciously chose to forego legal options. Mulligan's last meal is unrecorded, likely because he rejected the usual pre-execution formalities. His final words, heard faintly through the execution chamber glass, reflected both protest and resignation. "I am innocent. You're killing an innocent man. I've tried to tell you over and over. I won't be here to defend myself, but I hope someone else will. And I hope you know Georgia's death penalty law is wrong. It is wrong." Edward Earl Johnson, State, Mississippi. On June 2, 1979, in Walnut Grove, Mississippi, Edward Earl Johnson, an 18-year-old African-American, was accused of breaking into the home of Sally Franklin, a 69-year-old white woman, and sexually assaulting her. While fleeing, he allegedly shot and killed Marshal J.T. Trest, who had responded to the emergency call. Johnson was arrested shortly after. The prosecution's key evidence was a taped confession, which Johnson claimed was forced. According to him, officers took him into the woods, pointed guns at him, and made him sign a statement he didn't understand. The main witness, Sally Franklin, initially failed to identify him. A close friend known as Big Mary testified that Johnson was with her at the time of the crime, but her statement was dismissed by authorities. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and the murder weapon was never recovered. In 1981, he was sentenced to death. His defense was inadequate. Key witnesses weren't called, and his alibi wasn't properly investigated. Throughout the process, Johnson maintained his innocence. He stated, "They made me confess in the woods, pointing guns at me." As you've probably noticed in other cases over the years, there are usually very few images of the inmates. However, this case is different. Several documentaries were filmed at this prison in Mississippi during that time, so there's a good amount of audiovisual material showing the prisoners. His last meal was a shrimp cocktail, something he had never tried before. While eating, he requested a small music box that played Always by Atlantic Starr, the song his family dedicated to him during their final visit. He was executed by lethal gas. The execution took place at 12:06 a.m. at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman. His last words were, "Well, I guess nobody's going to call. Okay, let's get this over with." Years later, prison superintendent Don Cabana became a vocal critic of the death penalty, convinced that Johnson might have been innocent. The BBC documentary, 14 Days in May, captured Johnson's final days and sparked international debate over racism and wrongful convictions on death row. Richard Tucker Jr., State, Georgia. On September 15, 1978, 37-year-old Richard Tucker Jr. kidnapped Edna Sandifer, a 50-year-old retired nurse, in Macon, Georgia. He forced her to drive to a remote location where he raped her and then brutally beat her to death with an iron bar. This crime happened just 6 months after Tucker was released from prison, where he had served 13 years for murdering his aunt in 1964 by stabbing her with scissors. His criminal record also included robbery and attempted rape. After Sandifer's murder, witnesses saw Tucker driving her car. A friend, Willie Lee Mahone, said Tucker confessed to killing a white woman and that he enjoyed killing and would do it again. Police found Tucker's fingerprint on one of Sandifer's credit cards and discovered a garment with a white pubic hair in his apartment. Tucker, who was African American, did not know Sandifer. Police concluded she was a random victim. At trial, Tucker's recorded confession was presented. He later claimed he confessed under pressure and blamed Mahone for the murder, but admitted to undressing the victim to remove evidence. The jury found him guilty of murder and kidnapping with bodily harm in January 1979. Tucker appealed, arguing the admission of photos and denial of an independent psychiatric exam were improper. All appeals were denied. His criminal history and parole status influenced the parole board's denial of clemency. For his last meal, Tucker requested fried shrimp, coleslaw, and hush puppies. On May 22, 1987, at 7:23 p.m., 44-year-old Richard Tucker Jr. was executed by electrocution at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Center in Jackson. He gave no final statement but requested a last prayer, which was offered by Reverend Nolan Lavelle. Witnesses said he appeared calm and thoughtful. Anthony Charles Williams. State, Texas. On the night of June 1, 1978, 13-year-old Vicki Lynn Wright left the parking lot of Big Texas Bowling Alley around 8:45 p.m. to get change from a friend's 1977 El Camino. When she didn't return, her sister and friends searched but found the car was missing. Between 9 and 10 p.m., several friends saw Williams driving the El Camino recklessly. He told them it belonged to his girlfriend and that the blood on his shirt was from a fight. The next day, June 13th, Vicki's body was found in a wooded area near Williams' neighborhood. Detectives showed a photo of the El Camino at the scene, and 2 friends identified it and said they saw Williams driving it the night before. Police went to Williams' house. He fled through the back door to a nearby abandoned house where he was found hiding in the attic and arrested at 7:55 p.m. At the station, Williams confessed in writing to approaching Vicki at the bowling alley, taking her to a dark spot near a bayou and beating her with his fist and a bowling pin. Williams was charged with capital murder during kidnapping, robbery, and aggravated rape. He pleaded not guilty but was found guilty and sentenced to death in 1978. During sentencing, prosecutors introduced evidence of 4 other alleged crimes by Williams, including assaults and rapes of other women. 3 victims identified him as their attacker. Williams spent nearly 9 years on death row, appealing on grounds of childhood brain injury, inadequate medical exams, and poor legal representation. He won execution delays in 1982 and 1985. His final appeals argued racial discrimination, as Williams was black and Vicky was white. All appeals were denied. On May 27, 1987, Texas courts rejected all stays and appeals, including a 7-2 Supreme Court refusal. Williams spent his last day playing dominoes with guards, visiting siblings, reading the paper, and talking to his mother by phone. Upon learning of the Supreme Court's denial, he appeared shocked. When offered his last meal, he chose a piece of fish. Before execution, he was offered his last words and said, "Mother, I'm sorry for causing you all this pain. I want to thank everyone who helped me. Thank you all. Ernest and Otis, take care of Mom. Take care of the family. I want to thank everyone who helped me. Thank you all." Williams was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville State Prison, Texas, on May 28, 1987. At 27 years old, he smiled as he lay on the gurney. The procedure began at 12:12 a.m., and he was pronounced dead at 12:22 a.m. No signs of suffering were reported. William Boyd Tucker. State, Georgia. On August 20, 1977, William Boyd Tucker, then 21 years old, entered a magic market in Columbus, Georgia. Under the influence of alcohol and marijuana, he forced 19-year-old cashier Kathleen Perry, who was 3 weeks pregnant, to hand over the cash register money. He then abducted her in his red Volkswagen and drove to a rural area. There, he stabbed her 4 times and left her body in a ditch. Witnesses who saw his vehicle and one of Perry's shoes near the scene helped police identify Tucker. He was arrested just hours later. In his first confession, Tucker admitted to the robbery and killing, but denied raping Perry. However, forensic evidence, including fingerprints and semen, confirmed sexual assault. The autopsy showed Perry died from internal bleeding caused by the stab wounds. In March 1978, Tucker was tried in Muskogee County. Prosecutors charged him with capital murder, kidnapping with bodily injury, and armed robbery. The jury found him guilty in less than an hour. After just 9 minutes of deliberation, he was sentenced to death. Over the next 9 years, Tucker filed multiple appeals. His attorneys argued that the jury received unconstitutional instructions, that his defense was ineffective, and that Georgia's death penalty system was racially biased. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal in a 6-3 decision. Justice Brennan dissented, claiming the jury instructions may have violated constitutional protections. On May 29, 1987, William Boyd Tucker was executed in Georgia's electric chair at the age of 31. The execution took place at 7:29 p.m. in Jackson State Prison. The process lasted 2 minutes. Governor Joe Frank Harris did not intervene. Tucker spent his final day reading and visiting with relatives. His last meal included a deluxe hamburger, French fries, a Pepsi, and ice cream. Before the execution, he read a statement. "No matter how sterile and sanitary you make this execution, it's still murder. You are as guilty as I am. I am a product of your creation." His final words were, "God bless you all." Benjamin Berry, State, Louisiana. On January 30, 1978, 24-year-old Benjamin Berry and his accomplice David Pennington traveled from Baton Rouge to Jefferson Parish to rob a branch of the Metairie Bank and Trust. Pennington entered first to scout the location and noticed Robert Cochran, a 34-year-old off-duty sheriff's deputy working as an armed security guard. Moments later, Barry entered with a .38 special revolver and demanded money from the tellers. During the robbery, Cochran drew his weapon. In the exchange of gunfire, Barry shot 3 times. 2 bullets struck Cochran, one in the shoulder, the other fatally in the chest. Cochran managed to fire once, wounding Barry in the thigh before dying at the scene. Barry and Pennington fled with $4,373. Barry was arrested later that day at a Baton Rouge hospital while seeking treatment. The evidence was overwhelming. Barry's fingerprints were found at the scene and in the getaway car. The fatal bullet matched his revolver. Multiple witnesses identified him at the bank. In October 1978, Barry was tried for first-degree murder under Louisiana law, which allowed the death penalty for homicides committed during robberies. His attorney argued Barry acted in self-defense, but forensic experts testified that Cochran was shot at close range, likely while incapacitated. Barry later appealed, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel. His lawyer, Fred Blanche III, was accused of using narcotics during the trial period. Though testimony supported the claim, the judge dismissed it due to lack of conclusive evidence. Barry's defense also failed to present expert testimony on his drug history or mental health. On June 7, 1987, Benjamin Barry was executed in Louisiana's electric chair at Angola State Prison. He was 31 years old. The execution began at 12:01 a.m. and lasted less than 2 minutes. No signs of distress were reported, though witnesses described the smell of burning flesh as overwhelming. Barry declined to make a final statement. His last meal was tomato and egg sandwiches, French fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Alvin R. Moore, Jr., State, Louisiana. On July 9, 1980, 20-year-old Alvin R. Moore, Jr. was accused of brutally stabbing Joanne Wilson, a 23-year-old mother, inside her home in Bossier City, Louisiana. Wilson, who was stabbed 13 times, managed to call 911 before dying. Her final words were, "Alvin did it." Her 4-month-old baby was found unharmed in a nearby crib. Items like a stereo and a jar of coins had been stolen from the home. Moore, a former neighbor and co-worker of Wilson's husband, was arrested later that day. Blood type O, matching Wilson, was found on his pants. 2 acquaintances, Arthur Stewart and Dennis Sloan, initially testified that Moore entered the house alone, sexually assaulted Wilson, and later said, "I stabbed that bitch 9 times." Their testimony played a key role in Moore's conviction, although they recanted their statements in sworn affidavits in 1986. Moore was tried in 1980 by an all-white jury in a parish with a documented history of racial bias. His court-appointed attorney, Stacey Freeman, provided a minimal defense. He failed to interview critical witnesses, presented no mitigating evidence, and spent only 2 minutes arguing for Moore's life during sentencing. Freeman later admitted he would have felt silly begging for his life. He also ignored medical records indicating Moore may have suffered brain damage from a childhood injury. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal by a 7-2 vote. Justices Brennan and Marshall dissented, pointing to racial imbalance and lack of due process. On June 9, 1987, at age 27, Alvin R. Moore, Jr. was executed in Louisiana's electric chair at the state penitentiary in Angola. In the hours before his death, Moore met with his spiritual advisor, Reverend Roger Stinson, who read from the Book of John and urged him to ask for forgiveness. Alvin Moore, Jr.'s last words, "You may kill my body, but not my soul." Moore made no public final statement. These words were spoken privately to his attorney. Jimmy L. Glass, State, Louisiana. On December 24, 1982, 20-year-old Jimmy Glass escaped from the Webster Parish Jail alongside his cellmate Jimmy Wingo. That same night, they broke into the home of Newton and Earlene Brown, a couple from Dixie Inn, Louisiana. The Browns were tied up, gagged, and shot point-blank in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Their bodies were discovered the next day by their son. Glass was arrested days later. During interrogation, he claimed that Wingo had forced him to shoot, but ballistic evidence and witness testimony pointed to Glass as the gunman responsible for the double murder. In April 1983, he was tried in Lafayette. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder in less than an hour. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution emphasized his violent criminal history and the brutality of the killings. Glass appealed his sentence, arguing that electrocution constituted cruel and unusual punishment. His legal team presented medical evidence detailing the pain and damage caused by the electric chair. In 1985, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review the case by a narrow 5-4 vote. Justices Thurgood Marshall and William Brennan dissented, calling electrocution torture. During his final 24 hours, Glass appeared calm, even defiant. He joked with guards and ate a last meal of pepperoni pizza, chef salad with blue cheese dressing, peaches with cream, and 2 soft drinks. When asked if he had any final words, he replied, "Yeah, I guess I'd rather be fishing." The execution took place on June 12, 1987, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. Jimmy Glass was 25 years old. He was executed in the electric chair. There was no intervention from the governor. Individuals: Jimmy C. Wingo. State: Louisiana. On the night of December 24, 1982, 32-year-old Jimmy C. Wingo, a former police officer, escaped from the Webster Parish Jail in Minden, Louisiana, alongside his cellmate Jimmy Glass. The guards, distracted by a television program, failed to notice their absence. Wingo and Glass followed the railroad tracks to Dixie Inn, where a robbery turned into a brutal double homicide. Newton Brown, 55, and Earlene Neely Brown, 51, were found dead in their bedroom with gunshot wounds to the back of the head. Their bodies were bound, gagged, and showed signs of blunt trauma. Ballistics confirmed that the .22 caliber bullets came from Glass's weapon. Glass admitted to pulling the trigger but claimed he did so under Wingo's orders. Wingo, however, insisted he had separated from Glass hours earlier and had no part in the killings. In April 1983, Wingo was tried for first-degree murder in Lafayette. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, including his connection to Glass, possession of stolen items, and the testimony of his ex-girlfriend, Gwen, who claimed Wingo had confessed. The jury, composed entirely of white individuals, deliberated for just 50 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. During sentencing, the prosecutor emphasized Wingo's past as a police officer and labeled him inherently dangerous. In his final days, Wingo remained calm. He received visits from family members and a pastor. His last meal consisted of a seafood platter, shrimp and fried oysters, French fries, and a Coca-Cola. When asked for his final words, Jimmy Wingo said, "I am an innocent man. The state of Louisiana is murdering an innocent man. In the name of Christ, I forgive all those involved in this unjust persecution. I love you. God bless you and goodbye." The execution took place at 12:06 a.m. on June 16, 1987, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. Wingo was 35 years old. He was strapped to the electric chair with leather restraints and a saline-soaked hood placed on his head. 2 jolts of 2,300 volts over 45 seconds ended his life at 12:17 a.m. Witnesses reported the smell of burning flesh, but no unusual convulsions were observed. Elliot Rod Johnson. State: Texas. On April 8, 1982, 23-year-old Elliot Rod Johnson entered Granado's jewelry store in Beaumont, Texas, alongside his accomplice Morris Andrews. According to witness testimony, Johnson acted as the lookout, while Andrews shot 67-year-old store owner Joseph Granado in the head after Granado reached for a weapon. The robbery also resulted in the death of store employee Arturo Melendez, though Johnson was only tried for Granado's murder. Johnson was arrested shortly after the crime. During interrogation, he confessed to participating in the robbery but claimed Andrews was the one who pulled the trigger. Prosecutors presented a baseball cap found at the scene with hair samples linked to Johnson, though the defense later questioned the reliability of that evidence. Stolen jewelry was also recovered from Johnson's home in Port Arthur. In 1983, Johnson was tried for capital murder in a county with a known history of racial tension. The jury was all white. His court-appointed attorney, Sam Dunn, failed to present any mitigating evidence about Johnson's long-term drug addiction or possible brain damage. Johnson appealed his conviction, citing ineffective assistance of counsel, racial bias in jury selection, and procedural violations. His defense argued that his confession was obtained without proper safeguards and that key medical and psychological evidence was never presented. In 1985, the Fifth Circuit Court denied his appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case later that year. His execution was scheduled for midnight on June 24, 1987, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. However, complications delayed the procedure for nearly an hour. Years of heroin use had collapsed Johnson's veins, forcing technicians to attempt multiple needle insertions before successfully administering the lethal injection cocktail: sodium thiopental, pancuronium bromide, and potassium chloride. Witnesses described the scene as chaotic and distressing. His final words were, "I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused those who loved me. I hope my friends can forgive me." Minutes before the execution, Johnson spoke by phone with his mother, Luana Johnson, who was incarcerated in another Texas prison for robbery. Richard Lee Whitley, State, Virginia. On July 25, 1980, 34-year-old Richard Lee Whitley visited the home of his 63-year-old neighbor, Phoebe Parsons, in Pimmit Hills, Fairfax County, Virginia. He claimed he wanted to talk about his recent marital separation. Parsons, a widow who lived alone and had previously hired Whitley for minor repair work, let him in. During the conversation, Whitley strangled her, tied a cord around her neck, and slashed her throat with a razor, leaving a 4.75-inch wound. After killing her, he stripped her body, dragged it to her bedroom, and covered it with clothes and objects. He then sexually violated her corpse with an umbrella, a disturbing detail revealed during the autopsy. Whitley stole her purse and fled in her car. At the crime scene, police found a broken link from his watch, bloodstains matching the victim's type, and footprints connecting him to the murder. After months on the run, he was arrested in Tampa, Florida, where he confessed during interrogation. In 1982, Whitley was tried in Fairfax. Prosecutors presented his confession, the watch link, and witness testimony placing him near the scene. His defense attorney, Samuel W. Hickson III, failed to present mitigating psychological evidence or properly challenge the forensic case. Whitley appealed, citing ineffective counsel and racial bias in jury selection. In 1985, a federal judge temporarily halted the execution, but the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that decision. On July 6, 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal in a 6-2 vote. Justices Thurgood Marshall and William Brennan dissented. Governor Gerald Baliles denied clemency, calling the crime horrific in nature. Whitley spent his final hours at the Richmond prison, receiving visits from his sister and religious ministers. Witnesses said he remained unnervingly calm and declined to make any final statement. He was executed in the electric chair at 11:07 p.m. on July 6, 1987. The execution lasted 5 minutes from the first jolt. No signs of suffering were officially reported, though secret NPR recordings later revealed confusion among prison staff during the procedure's recording. Richard Lee Whitley was 41 years old. John Russell Thompson, State, Texas. On May 21, 1977, 22-year-old John Russell Thompson entered the Pioneer Store and Lock Warehouse in San Antonio with a .45 caliber pistol. His plan was simple: rob the office and flee. Inside, 70-year-old employee Mary Nooper was counting cash. When Thompson demanded the money, Nooper reportedly laughed. He raised the gun and shot her once in the chest. The bullet pierced her lung. She died minutes later from internal bleeding. Thompson fled the scene with his 2 accomplices, Fernando Guerrero and Christy Sparks Moore, but they left empty-handed. Investigators quickly identified Thompson's vehicle near the scene, and a traffic citation issued to him just hours before the crime placed him in the area. Ballistics matched the bullet to a pistol borrowed from Moore's stepfather. Thompson was arrested days later. He admitted to the robbery but claimed the shooting was unintentional. In 1978, Thompson was tried for capital murder. Christy Sparks Moore testified that Thompson had planned the robbery and pulled the trigger when Nooper resisted. Prosecutors highlighted his past arrests for drug offenses and violent conduct. His defense argued that the shooting was impulsive, not premeditated. Judge Peter Michael Curry called the sentence justified by the cold-blooded execution of an elderly woman. Over the next 9 years, Thompson's legal team filed appeals citing procedural errors, including emotional testimony from the victim's husband and lack of clear intent to kill. All appeals were rejected. In early 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition. His last meal was simple: fresh squeezed orange juice. Thompson spent his last hours at Huntsville Prison with his family and a chaplain. He declined to speak publicly, telling the chaplain only that he wanted to communicate with God. John Thompson had no last words. Connie Ray Evans, State, Mississippi. On April 8, 1981, Connie Ray Evans, 21 years old, walked into RJ's Food Center in Jackson, Mississippi, with his accomplice Alfonso Artis. Artis pulled a .38 revolver and forced the store clerk, 28-year-old Aaron Pawa, to kneel behind the counter. Evans entered moments later, took the gun, and stood watch while Artis tried to open the cash register. When he failed, they made Pawa get up, open the register, then kneel again. Evans shot him in the head at point-blank range. They fled with just $140. Evans was arrested soon after. Artis confessed and identified Evans as the shooter. The revolver, borrowed from Artis's stepfather, matched the bullets found in Pawa's body. Evans also confessed, though he claimed the shooting was accidental. Artis told police that Evans said, "I did it because I'm cold-hearted." In court, Evans pleaded guilty to capital murder, skipping the guilt phase. The judge upheld the sentence, calling the act cold and deliberate. Evans appealed, arguing racial bias in jury selection and poor legal defense. All courts denied his appeals. Mississippi Governor Bill Allen refused clemency. His last meal was a cheese omelet, fried okra, and chocolate cake. On July 8, 1987, Evans was executed in the gas chamber at Mississippi State Penitentiary. He was 27. The execution began at 12:22 a.m., and he was pronounced dead 2 minutes later. No sedatives were given. Witnesses said he inhaled deeply, then lost consciousness. His final words were, "From one Christian to another, I love you. Bet I'll tell the man how good you are." Willie Lawrence Celestine, State, Louisiana. On September 13, 1981, Willie Lawrence Celestine, 24 years old, broke into the home of 81-year-old Marceliane Richard in Lafayette, Louisiana. Under the influence of amphetamines and alcohol, he entered through a bathroom window, leaving a fingerprint on the sink. Inside, he raped her, then strangled her so violently that he fractured a neck vertebra and 7 ribs. She died from manual strangulation. Her body was found hours later. Celestine was arrested after investigators matched his fingerprint at the scene. In a taped confession, he admitted to the crime but blamed it on intoxication. He said he didn't know the victim and acted impulsively. During sentencing, they found 3 aggravating factors. The murder occurred during aggravated rape. Celestine had prior convictions for sexual assault, and the act was extremely cruel. Celestine appealed, arguing poor legal defense and racial bias in jury selection. His lawyers also cited his IQ of 69 as evidence of intellectual disability, but in 1987, the law did not bar such executions. All appeals failed. The U.S. Supreme Court denied review, and Governor Edwin Edwards denied clemency. His last meal was crawfish étouffée, salad with Italian dressing, and a soft drink. His final words were, "I want to tell the Richard family I'm very sorry. I hope they can find it in their hearts to forgive me. Tell my family I love them. And thank you, Sister Helen, for staying with me." On July 20th, 1987, Celestine was executed in the electric chair at Angola Prison. He was 30 years old. 2 jolts of 2,300 volts ended his life at 12:27 a.m. Witnesses reported no unusual signs of suffering, though many described a strong smell of burning flesh. His last meal was crawfish étouffée, salad with Italian dressing, and a soft drink. Willie Lawrence Watson. State, Louisiana. On April 5, 1981, Willie Lawrence Watson, then 25, abducted 25-year-old Tulane medical student Kathy Newman at gunpoint from her apartment parking lot in New Orleans. Addicted to drugs and desperate for money, he forced her to drive to a remote area in St. Charles Parish. There, he robbed her, raped her, and shot her in the back of the head. Watson later confessed, saying he feared she could identify him. He blamed the crime on his addiction and a troubled upbringing in New Orleans public housing. The investigation linked Watson to the crime through fingerprint evidence and the testimony of accomplices. In a taped confession, he described the entire crime in detail. The bullet retrieved from Newman's skull matched a gun found in Watson's possession. On July 24, 1987, Watson was executed in the electric chair at Angola Prison. He was 31 years old. The execution began at 2:09 a.m. and lasted 11 minutes. No signs of unusual suffering were reported, though witnesses described a smell of burning flesh in the chamber. Watson refused his last meal and declined to make a final statement. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply shook his head. John E. Brogdon. State, Louisiana. On October 7, 1981, 19-year-old John E. Brogdon and his accomplice, Bruce Parrott, 17, approached 11-year-old Barbara Jo Brown outside a convenience store in Luling, Louisiana. They convinced her to get into their car and drove to a secluded area. There, they committed acts of extreme violence that resulted in the child's death. Investigators linked Brogdon to the scene through fingerprints and recovered evidence. He confessed to the crime during questioning, admitting he and Parrott acted under the influence of drugs and alcohol. In 1982, Brogdon was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated assault. A year later, the Louisiana Supreme Court overturned the sentence due to faulty jury instructions. Brogdon was retried in 1983, and a second jury again recommended the death penalty. The verdict was upheld in 1984. Brogdon appealed his case, arguing that the jury selection process was racially biased and that his defense failed to present key evidence, including his low IQ score of 71 and a troubled upbringing. His legal team also questioned the fairness of executing someone so young and with possible intellectual limitations. The courts rejected all appeals. On July 30th, 1987, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, John E. Brogdon was executed by electric chair. He was 25 years old. The procedure began at 12:12 a.m. and concluded in under 10 minutes. No unusual complications were reported. His final words were, "God bless you all. Sterling J. Rault, Jr., State, Louisiana." On March 1st, 1982, 36-year-old Sterling J. Rault, Jr., Assistant Controller at Louisiana Energy and Development Corp., left work with 21-year-old Secretary Jane Ellen Francione. Witnesses near the University of New Orleans later saw the two in a struggle in a parking lot, where Francione was heard shouting for help. Hours later, Francione's body was discovered in a remote area of eastern New Orleans. Evidence at the scene linked Rault to the crime, including a shell casing that matched a revolver found in his vehicle. The prosecution argued that Rault killed Francione to prevent her from exposing an $84,000 embezzlement scheme he had orchestrated at El Idco. Raul had opened a fraudulent account and forged company checks under the president's name. At trial, multiple witnesses testified about the parking lot altercation and Raul's flight from the scene. The defense attempted to introduce evidence obtained under hypnosis, claiming Raul had repressed memories of trauma and suffered from a dissociative condition, but this was rejected by the court. After brief deliberation, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Raul appealed, arguing that excluding hypnosis-based testimony harmed his defense and that the use of overlapping factors to justify the death penalty was unconstitutional. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal in a 7-2 decision. Governor Edwin Edwards also declined to intervene. On August 24, 1987, Rault was executed in the electric chair at Angola Prison. He was 36 years old. His final meal included a T-bone steak, fried shrimp, French fries, strawberry cake, and a Pepsi. Before the execution, he told his aunt, Sister Mary Rault, "The public is killing an innocent man. I pray God forgives everyone. I go from death row to the line of eternal life." His final gesture was a thumbs up and the words, "I love you," to his aunt. He was pronounced dead at 12:16 a.m., 6 minutes after the process began. Beauford James White. State, Florida. On July 27, 1977, Beauford James White, age 28, accompanied Marvin Francois and John Ferguson to a home in Carroll City, Miami. Under the pretense of being utility workers, the three men entered the residence, where they tied up the occupants and waited for others to arrive. Their goal was related to an unresolved drug dispute. When Livingston Stalker and 5 friends arrived, they were also tied and placed face down. Francois and Ferguson then carried out a coordinated attack. White, according to his own confession, remained by the front door to ensure no one escaped. 2 people survived by pretending to be unconscious and later identified the attackers. White was arrested soon after, and during questioning, admitted to being at the scene but denied knowing the full extent of the plan. In 1978, White was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 4 counts of robbery. During sentencing, the jury unanimously recommended life in prison, citing that White did not commit the killings himself nor plan them. However, Judge Paul Baker overruled this decision, one of the most controversial practices in Florida at the time, and sentenced him to death. White appealed, referencing the Enmond v. Florida decision, which limits the death penalty to those who actually kill or intend to kill. His appeal was denied, and in 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld his sentence. Governor Bob Graham declined clemency. On August 28, 1987, Beauford James White was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark. He was 38 years old. He declined a special last meal and religious services. When asked if he had any final words, he replied, "No, sir." He was pronounced dead at 7:11 a.m. Wayne Eugene Ritter, State, Alabama. On January 5, 1977, Wayne Eugene Ritter, 22 years old at the time, entered a pawn shop in Mobile, Alabama, with John Lewis Evans III, an ex-cellmate. While Ritter asked the shop owner, Edward Nassar, to see a firearm, Evans pulled a gun and announced a robbery. As Nassar attempted to flee, Evans shot him fatally in front of his two young daughters. After the killing, Ritter and Evans went on a multi-state crime spree, committing dozens of armed robberies and several kidnappings across 7 states. They were caught 2 months later in Arkansas. Inside their vehicle, authorities recovered stolen weapons, including the one used to kill Nassar. In 1977, Ritter pleaded guilty to capital murder. However, under Alabama law, a jury trial was required to impose a death sentence. During the proceedings, Ritter testified that he was fully willing to shoot if Evans hadn't been in his line of fire. At one point, he told the jury, "If you give me life, I'll be out in 10 years and I'll come after you." The jury returned a unanimous death recommendation after just 15 minutes. Ritter's appeals challenged the use of the electric chair, arguing it was excessively painful, and questioned the fairness of sentencing someone to death who didn't personally fire the fatal shot. The courts rejected both claims, citing his active role and intent. On August 28, 1987, Wayne Eugene Ritter was executed in Alabama's Holcombe Correctional Facility. He was 33 years old. He declined to make a final statement. Witnesses said he entered the execution chamber calmly and smiled at the guards. Dale Selby Pierre, State, Utah. On April 22, 1974, Dale Selby Pierre, 21 years old, participated in one of Utah's most brutal crimes, the Hi-Fi murders in Ogden. Alongside William Andrews and Keith Roberts, Pierre entered the Hi-Fi electronics store to commit a robbery. Inside, they took 5 people hostage, 2 employees and 3 customers. The victims were tortured in horrifying ways. Pierre forced them to drink Drano, causing internal chemical burns. He raped 18-year-old Michelle Ansley and shot her, Stanley Walker, 20, and Carol Naisbitt, 52, in the head. Only 2 victims survived, 16-year-old Courtney Naisbitt and 43-year-old Orrin Walker, both left with permanent injuries, including brain damage and severe burns. In 1974, Pierre was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated robbery. During trial, Pierre admitted to firing the shots, claiming he was in a rage. Over the next decade, Pierre appealed his sentence, citing racial bias. He was black in a predominantly white state, and alleged legal errors. All appeals were denied. In 1987, Utah Governor Norman Bangerter refused to grant clemency. On August 28, 1987, Dale Selby Pierre became the first person in Utah to be executed by lethal injection. He was 34 years old. He received the injection at 1:02 a.m. at the Utah State Prison. The process took 10 minutes. Witnesses, including family members of the victims, reported that Pierre remained calm. He did not offer any final statement. William Mitchell, State, Georgia. On August 11, 1974, William Billy Mitchell, 22 years old, entered the IGA store number 13 in Worth County, Georgia. Inside were 14-year-old Christopher Carr and his mother, Peggy Carr, who both worked there. Armed and aggressive, Mitchell demanded money, forced them into a walk-in freezer, and shot Christopher in the chest and then execution-style in the back of the head. He then shot Peggy multiple times. She survived and later testified against him. The robbery netted just $165. Mitchell was arrested later that same day. He confessed to the crime, claiming he was under the influence of drugs. The prosecution presented fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, and a taped confession in which Mitchell described the events in disturbing detail, even saying, "I never had a white bitch before," as he forced Peggy Carr into the freezer. In 1974, Mitchell pleaded guilty to capital murder and aggravated assault. Mitchell also received a life sentence for the robbery. On September 1st, William Mitchell was executed in the electric chair at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson. He was 35 years old. He spent his last hours with family and ministers. According to Warden Don Cabana, he remained defiant to the end. His last words were, "A few hours ago, Wayne Snow said I had no redeeming qualities. All I have to say to Wayne Snow is kiss my ass. Goodbye." Wayne Snow was the chairman of the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, who had publicly denied Mitchell's clemency earlier that day, Joseph Blaine Starvaggi, State, Texas. On November 19, 1976, Joseph Blaine Starvaggi, then 23 years old, broke into the home of John Denson in Magnolia, Texas. Alongside accomplices G.W. Green and Glenn Earl Martin, he intended to steal a collection of firearms worth over $6,000. John Denson, a 43-year-old probation officer and sheriff's deputy, resisted. Starvaggi shot him 3 times, once in the shoulder, then in the chest, and finally in the back of the head. Denson died on the scene, in front of his wife and 13-year-old daughter. During the robbery, Grace and Susan Denson were forced to sit covered with a blanket in the living room. Susan later testified that her father begged, "Please, I'm begging you, don't do this," before Starvaggi fired the fatal shots. When his accomplices urged him to kill the 2 surviving witnesses, Starvaggi refused, saying, "I only shoot junkies and pigs." He was arrested shortly after. Police matched his fingerprints to the crime scene, and ballistic evidence tied a .38 revolver, Denson's own gun, to the murder. Starvaggi confessed but claimed he was intoxicated on drugs and alcohol at the time. In 1978, he was found guilty of capital murder. They cited the deliberate cruelty and cold-blooded nature of the killing. Starvaggi appealed on several grounds, including improper jury selection under Texas law and claims of temporary insanity. He also argued that his nonviolent criminal record, consisting of theft and marijuana possession, did not justify the future danger standard used in Texas death penalty cases. All appeals were denied. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. Governor Bill Clements declined clemency. On September 10, 1987, Joseph Blaine Starvaggi was executed by lethal injection at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 34 years old. He declined both visitors and his last meal. Witnesses described him as stoic. He offered no final statement. Timothy Wesley McCorquodale, State, Georgia. On January 16, 1974, 22-year-old Timothy Wesley McCorquodale abducted 17-year-old Donna Marie Dixon in Atlanta, Georgia, after falsely accusing her of theft. Along with an unidentified accomplice known only as Leroy, McCorquodale took Donna to his girlfriend's apartment, where she was subjected to severe abuse over several hours. According to testimony, McCorquodale inflicted prolonged physical and psychological harm on the victim before ultimately ending her life by strangulation. He then attempted to hide her body in a trash container. Key witnesses, granted immunity, testified against him. McCorquodale also confessed, though he claimed to have no memory of the crime due to drug use. In 1974, a jury in Fulton County, composed entirely of white jurors, found him guilty of capital murder. They recommended the death penalty in less than an hour, citing extreme cruelty as an aggravating factor. His appeals focused on claims of ineffective legal counsel and alleged racial bias in Georgia's death penalty system. While both he and the victim were white, his defense pointed to statistical disparities in sentencing. The U.S. Supreme Court denied all appeals, and Georgia Governor Joe Frank Harris rejected his request for clemency in 1987. On September 21, 1987, Timothy McCorquodale was executed by electrocution at the Georgia State Prison in Jackson. He was 35 years old. His last meal included boiled shrimp, crab legs, a salad with Thousand Island dressing, and apple pie with ice cream. His final words were, "I want to tell Donna's family that I'm sorry. I hope you find peace." The execution began at 7 p.m. and lasted under 10 minutes. Witnesses described the scene as somber and quiet.